It's been almost 2 months since Russian President Vladimir Putin signed into law a regulation banning so-called LGBT propaganda in Russia. It prohibits what it calls promotion of non-traditional values. The change has already affected a wide range of books and films, with now illegal materials being removed. Critics say this is just one more step in what the Russian government sees as a fight against Western values.
Should this book be banned? A new Russian law says yes, if it depicts same-sex relationships positively. Introduced a month ago, this law criminalises the positive portrayal of non-heteronormative relationships in advertising, films, books and the media. The new legislation is creating unrest amongst publishers, film distributors and authors. This library in Moscow has already been told to pull quite a few books from its shelves.
In our electric catalog, there are now books with the entry, "Borrowing is no longer permitted." It's unclear why these particular books were selected.
Last December, the Duma, the Russian parliament, voted to toughen its so-called gay propaganda law. Critics complain that the criteria used to decide whether a certain work breaks the law are too vague. However, the target appears to be clear. It's an attack on what are ostensibly Western values. That's how the Russian human rights activist Igor Kochechkov sees it.
This is primarily anti-Western rhetoric. The assertion is that the West is imposing certain values on us and that something must be done about that.
And the chairman of the State Duma has some sharp words for the West.
Stop forcing alien values upon us. You've already destroyed your own. Who knows where it will end?
For Kochechkov, it's no surprise that this legislation has been passed during the Russian war on Ukraine.
The timing is obvious. The authorities want to push through their idea that the country is not fighting against Ukraine, but against the West as a whole, the US and the EU. They're trying to mobilize citizens and to convince them that they are our enemies.
Gays and lesbians are repeatedly victims of violence in Russia. Often, they are discriminated against by the state. There is, for example, a ban on LGBTQ symbols or holding public assemblies under the rainbow banner. While same-sex relationships as such were decriminalised in Russia back in 1993, critics say that the so-called gay propaganda law is stoking homophobia in the country.
It sends certain signals and raises the question, how will things develop? Will these people be sent to penal colonies at some point, or even murdered?
The activist Igor Kochechkov doesn't think that things will get to that point, though. But he is certain that the Russian government is hell-bent on turning back the clock to Soviet times.
More on this from our Moscow bureau chief, Yuri Resheto, who filed that report. He joins us from Riga, where he's been operating from since Russian authorities closed down our Moscow office. Welcome, Yuri. So we have this law there forbidding what they call propaganda about same-sex relationships. Is it clear what it means by propaganda?
Well, this law is supposed to punish what in Russia has been called the promotion of non-traditional sexual relationships. The criteria is very vague, Phil. If a TV show or a book, for example, presents what is called a distorted idea of the social equivalence of traditional, non-traditional, which means heterosexuals and homosexual relationships, or contributes to changing negative attitudes towards homosexual relationships into positive ones, then this TV show or book must disappear because it's supposed to be the so-called gay propaganda. But what exactly is meant seems to be in the eye of the beholder, and critics fear arbitrary decisions.
And how much does this change reflect the general mood against Russians towards its LGBT communities?
Well, we shouldn't generalize, of course, but in many ways, Russia is a patriarchal society in which the strong dominate the weak. Gays and lesbians are not the weakest members of society, but often the ones who can hardly defend themselves. Of course, there are always courageous activists who publicly protest injustice. However, they are also often been intimidated by the police, and their protests are crushed. The state doesn't want them to have the same rights as heterosexuals. This is the nature of Russian state-enforced homophobia. At the same time, most Russians live by the motto, do what you want with your partner at home, but only as long as you remain invisible as gay or lesbian.
Now, this is not the first time Russia has passed anti-gay legislation. How effective have previous bans been?
Well, the law has already been applied a few times. The previous one affected the so-called gay propaganda only among kids. The new one instead was extended to adults as well. It wasn't used very often in the past because hardly anyone dares to praise gay love in Russia. But the law affects a lot of people, though. It unsettles those who want to speak their minds publicly. Even more, book publishers are alarmed. They don't know which book they are allowed to print anymore. Theater directors don't know which performances they are allowed to play in their theaters. A few days ago, for example, the traditional St. Petersburg theater festival Rainbow changed its name because the rainbow is a symbol of the LGBTQ community. And last week in Siberia, in Omsk, a sculpture of colorful pigeons was to be placed on the riverbank to make the street more beautiful, but the mayor didn't allow it because he didn't want to allow the so-called gay propaganda. So I believe these examples show the impact of this law on all parts of society in Russia.
So are we likely to see more of this sort of legislation?
Well, the fear in the country is that not only LGBTQ people, but everyone who thinks differently will face far worse consequences if they continue to speak their mind and go against the official line. Because even if this law is not often applied, it causes anticipatory obedience, which can produce even worse results than required by the law. True to the motto, better too much than too little.
Thanks for that, Yuri. Our Moscow Bureau Chief, Yuri Reshetto.
And for more, let's bring in Jenny Mathers, an expert in Russian politics and security and a senior lecturer at Aberystwyth University in Wales. Welcome to the program, and thank you so much for joining us. Why the timing of this ban?
Well, it's pretty clear that, Putin's administration, since he returned to power in 2012, has been really cracking down on any kind of non-traditional social relationships, really wants to narrow the opportunities for any kind of dissent or opposition, whether it's to politics or to society. And of course, this process has accelerated since the war in Ukraine, since the mass invasion of almost a year ago, where, as some of your correspondents were saying, there is this conflation between the war that's going on in Ukraine and anti-Western feeling. And in the sense that, anything to do with more progressive values, which of course includes tolerance for LGBT people, comes under this broader heading of Western decadence and even Satanism, as Putin has sometimes described it. So it's a very extreme sort of reaction towards ideas from the West, but which are having a real, definite impact on actual people living in Russia.
Do you see the crackdown as, a sign of anything politically when we look at Putin's position itself? I mean, is it a sign of weakness, do you think?
I think it's a sign that he is very determined to make Russia's world much smaller. He's determined to limit the amount of opposition that he faces in any respect. And he's really playing to what we might think of as his base, which are middle-aged and older people in particular, because the younger people are much more tolerant and sort of outward-looking, but also people who are living in more rural areas, people who are more traditionally socially conservative, people who are more open to these kinds of ideas, and also don't have such a familiarity with life outside Russia. And so they might see it as plausible, really, that the West is actively trying to force these kinds of values onto Russia.
What do you think? And I mean, that brings me now to my next question. When we look at the general Russian public stance on same-sex relationships, how does that shake out?
Sure. So the last polls that we have from towards the end of 2021, before the mass invasion began and polling became much more fraught with difficulty, those polls suggest that about 2/3 of Russians probably do disapprove of same-sex relationships and homosexuality and LGBT people, and about 1/3 are much more welcoming and tolerant and regarded as normal. And that also breaks down, as I mentioned, very much along the lines of different age groups. So younger people being more likely to be tolerant, older people being less likely. Also, rural-urban divides. People who are more well-off versus people who are less well-off. So there are different ways to cut the popular view, I think. But about 2/3, if you say roughly, of Russians probably think that this law is absolutely fine.
Jenny Mathers, expert in Russian politics and security and a senior lecturer at Aberystwyth University in Wales. Thank you so much.